Welcome to the Predictive Pulse podcast. I'm Carlos Casas, CEO and Principal Analyst at Predictive Data Lab. We are your data science and media partner, and our team of experts are dedicated to providing strategic insights for data, research, and analysis. Our podcast explores the world of data and marketing analytics, helping you stay ahead of the curve. Join us on this journey to tap into tomorrow's insights today. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes as we embark on this data-driven adventure together. Well, welcome, you guys. It's so good to have you here again. Today, we're going to be talking about KPIs that matter, specifically for destination marketing. I think KPIs, as everyone knows, is a very hot topic, and it's very important, especially as we want to move a destination forward. There's a lot of different components in regards to KPIs. Some people call them key results or key business objectives, things of that nature. I like to reference it a little bit as to the SMIT. What is the single most important thing, right? What are we really trying to get to and really be the objective that we're trying to achieve? So I think we have a great discussion for us here. We have Dana Cody, our Director of Data Science. We have Stewart, our Director of Technology, and Oren Fanok, our lead data analyst. So, well, thank you guys for being here with us. It's really great to have you. So to get us started, right, about KPIs, we mentioned how, there's kind of different names for them, but when it comes to KPIs, what do you think, Oren, is some of the most important things that destination marketers should be looking at?
I'll start by framing KPIs as just a definition of KPIs, because you said there's a lot of different key objectives, key business metrics, things like that. KPIs at their simplest form, we like to think of them as objectives that matter to driving destination growth. You can call them whatever you want, but the underlying capability of a KPI is a key measure that we can use to drive destination growth. Some KPIs that we like to look at are KPIs that use visitation data. We have a lot of different data sources at our disposal that allow us to get a lot deeper than just click metrics, impressions, CPM, CTR, things like that. I'm sure in this discussion, we'll get a little bit deeper in the different KPIs that we like, but in short, KPIs are just those key objectives that allow us to grow a destination that we can measure against.
Yeah. So, do you guys feel like every single destination should have, obviously, KPIs? Is that something that Dana?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Your KPI should be defined as close as you can get to your goal, essentially. Your goal is to grow X amount over this. Well, you want to pick a KPI that gets you as close to actually reporting on that growth. So star reporting is a lot of times for our DMO clients a very, very important KPI, because that's self-reported by the hotels, and visitation data like from geolocation companies is very useful because you can see more of, how people travel through that destination, but it's not perfect because you're not able to actually see where those people are staying and how much money they're spending and all that. So there's pros and cons to all of it. And you ultimately need to understand and try to anchor your KPI to your goal to grow, essentially.
So, when we work with a lot of clients or really any destination marketer, we often hear basically we need more heads and beds, right? We have a limited number of rooms in our destination. We need more heads and beds. So with that, right, how do we kick off really understanding how do we do that, right? Like, what are the KPI framework we want to develop, knowing that for most of the destinations, they're really trying to get heads and beds?
Yeah, so I think whenever we look at something like that, step one is that. So we want heads and beds, and we kind of take a look at the greater ecosystem for the business. What does that exactly mean? Is this like, and this one's a pretty obvious one where it's literally like, let's get the occupancy as high as possible. But then we look at how can we actually measure that? Because if we can't measure that, how can we track if we're making progress towards it? So we do have things like this star data and whatnot that allows us to see like, okay, what's roughly are we looking at? And we may not have that for all hotels, and we have to kind of extrapolate, but now we have kind of a guideline that we can follow. And then we start working backwards from that towards what are things that are more directly measurable by us that maybe don't require such a lag time of waiting for this data to come in. And then we can kind of, again, work back to that to now, what can we actually like put into the system to start trying to test and experiment and find ways to actually move those numbers. But tracing that all the way from beginning to end, from like we run a new ad, we build a new campaign, how do we go from there and then see what its actual impact on heads and beds is down the road.
Right. So with, when someone or a marketer says we need more heads and beds, right? What do you recommend, Oren, in terms of helping design KPIs that ultimately have that as a direct response to it? Or, how do you embark on ultimately understanding what are the KPIs that we need?
I think understanding the KPI discussion, like heads and beds, goes down to a really thorough conversation with the client to understand, what does heads and beds actually mean? Yes, it just means people coming to the hotel, but are there certain heads and beds that matter more? Are there certain customers that stay longer and spend more that we should be tracking? Are there certain customers that maybe boost our occupancy during the off season? So heads and beds seems like a pretty simple KPI, but when you break it down, there's actually quite a few facets that feed that overall metric. So what we like to do is, like I said, have a sit down call with our team and the client and really understand what their destination does in terms of measuring heads and beds. We talked about the star report, hot text, key data. We want to see what data we have. And then from that data, we want to understand a little bit more what the actual customer coming to that destination is in terms of what do they look like, how old are they, how much do they spend, how long do they stay?
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, we'll frame our KPIs in a way that is pretty specific to the destination. So the KPI heads and beds seems very simple, but there's quite a few facets that we try to tie in to be a little bit more accurate and a little bit more tailored to each destination.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? Because for example, the saying heads in bed, obviously we're just trying to grow our visitor count in many instances, right? Get a higher occupancy. But how does that really come down to revenue, right? What does that really mean when it comes to profitability for a hotel? Right, or long-term growth of the destination as general, right? So I think those are all things that you have to take into account as part of that. Dana, what are your thoughts in regards to who should be in the table when we're talking about KPIs?
Well, definitely the director of marketing and whoever is designing and thinking about what these goals are should be in those conversations. Obviously, members of your media team and your predictive data lab team as well.
Shout out.
Yeah, it's there. Something that I was thinking about when Oren was kind of addressing these nuances behind these KPIs is there's this like kind of conundrum with KPIs where the more precise and the closer that KPI gets to your actual goal, it's not that it becomes less accurate, but like I think of star reporting, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Star reporting is a great example because it is self-reported from the hotel, so it's as real and as close to the truth as it gets. But a lot of times, Star doesn't actually report on all of the activity in a destination.
Right.
So you are getting closer and closer to the truth, but getting smaller and smaller coverage to the actual whole phenomenon. So it's kind of just like a double-edged sword in balancing all of these different KPIs so that you have as close to the truth as possible, as well as having some KPIs that may be a little fuzzy, maybe a little not as close to the truth as we want, but directionally would be able to tell you if you're up or down. And I think another important part is like having these KPIs with those pros and cons and understanding those nuances, being able to understand if when these KPIs tell different stories.
Right.
Mm-hmm. This number's up, but this number's down. So what does that actually tell me about what's going on?
Yeah.
As opposed to, freaking out and wondering if something's wrong. No, like sometimes this will be up and this will be down, but that's a very specific situation that's actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and kind of going off of what you're saying with that, and Oren, you'd mentioned like we just want this number up and stuff. Understanding like really, really fundamentally, okay, how is this exactly measured? Like I want to know how, like the moment that data enters the system, how is it generated? Because what we might see is something like, the way it's entered is based on every new person, new unique individual who like stays at a hotel.
Mhm.
But that may actually be bad for the hotel in the long run, because that turnover of having new people daily, even though they're trying to drive that number up, that is going to cost them more in the form of housekeeping and like the check-in, check-out. They've got a staff for that. So instead, like looking at it and saying like, okay, is this measured by individual? Is it measured by nights stayed? And ideally it's measured by nights stayed. And
Right.
then we can look at other metrics alongside that to further refine our process, to say like, okay, let's get not just our heads and beds numbers up, but maybe once we're hitting a limit where like we are having negligible impact to get further,
Right.
let's focus on something new like occupancy duration.
Mhm.
So now we've reduced their operating costs while still
Right.
keeping that other number high.
Right. That's a great point, right? Because one of the main things that hotels focus many instances is RevPAR, so revenue per available room. That's their number. That's one of the things that the general manager is constantly focused on, because that takes into account not just the occupancy numbers, but also their cost, right? Their cost of operating. But many times, as a destination marketer, you're not really focused on RevPAR. You're only focused on occupancy or room demand, right? You're trying to grow room demand as much as possible. But understanding how the whole picture comes into play, I think is really important. But I do want to lean in a little bit more as to what you mentioned, Dana, because, many times with KPIs, you can get an exhaustive list of a ton of stuff, right?
Mm.
But that's not always the best thing to do, especially when or on the reverse side, you can just focus on too few KPIs. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, it's funny because I always think of, if you have, 15, 20 different KPIs, that's like the equivalent of, let's highlight the important part and highlight everything. I'm highlighting every single word in the book because that's the
Right.
important. It's not the key performance indicators if you choose every single number that you
Right.
possibly can. So what I like to do in these conversations with clients is actually make the distinction between primary and secondary KPIs. So primary KPIs are our North Star. This is our KPIs. If we see that we are off pace, we hit pause, we meet up, we brainstorm, and we talk about how can we improve these numbers to get to and achieve our goals.
Right.
Our secondary KPIs are not the ring the alarm bells, let's all meet
Right.
up. Our secondary KPIs are more designed to provide context to those primary KPIs,
Right.
so you can understand more of the nuances of what those numbers are telling you.
Right.
And sometimes it's those primary KPIs can be something that like these numbers are more like leading indicators of your actual primary KPIs, and they tell you how you are trending to actually reach your goals. But making that distinction so that you can have less KPIs, but also it's not that those all 15 numbers aren't something you want to look at and aren't
Right.
important, but you want to be laser focused on your goals.
Right. Right. That's interesting. So Jeb, from your perspective, from capturing all the data, right, into the technology piece, how does that go into play when it comes to KPIs?
Yeah. So a huge part of my job is to try and like unify the real world with the world of data.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to create a model within our system that is an accurate representation of the real world. And so honestly, it's just kind of a lot of grunt work of like trying to understand these systems at a very fundamental level. So understanding these KPIs, and like I said, like what's the moment that data enters the system, and what factors from the real world affected why it got there when it did, and in what format it got there. And then taking a look and being like, how does this data change over time? Because we've talked a lot about like these like self-reported data sources.
Right.
And it's like, we might have a month lag on that. And we need to be hyper aware of these things in the system so that when we push a new campaign or push a new strategy or something like that to try and make change, that we're not assessing it 2 weeks later and saying, well, nothing's happening, we need to change again. It's like,
Right.
we're going to be shooting at a target that hasn't even arrived at the location. Like our arrow and our target haven't even met in the same point in time.
Right.
So as I build that model, these are like the kind of things I have to take into account and then all the competing factors from the different groups, because it's like we talk about KPIs like it's this one unifying thing that runs through everybody for like these problems, and it's not. Like we might have an internal KPI that we're trying to hit. The DMO might have their own KPI, like the heads and beds and things. And we've got to make sure that everybody's kind of moving at least in the right direction.
Right.
And so honestly, it's just a lot about trying to understand the real world as best as possible, but then also recognizing where can we actually measure, track, and analyze it. Because those don't always completely overlap.
Right. And so let's try to understand that a little bit better, right? From a real world implication when it comes to KPIs. And we'll touch on time in just a little bit, because I think that's a really important factor. But when it comes to real world implications, many times we'll talk about KPIs such as the impression volume and reach, which are important, and to Dana's point, secondary KPIs in many instances. But when it comes to real world, what are you referencing here in this instance, Jeb?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's a perfect reference to what you're talking about, but I do want to just share an anecdote that I've experienced with kind of KPIs gone wrong. And so I used to be a mechanical engineer. And when I was working at one of my first jobs, we had a repair department. So these units would come in and they would get repaired, and then they'd go to quality assurance, which was a different department. And so they implemented these KPIs and they said, okay, repair, your KPI is number of units repaired per day, or like average time it takes to do repair. That's the number you're looking at. And then quality assurance, it's like basically how many of these also pass through the longer term testing. So when they implemented these KPIs, repair got really good at repairing these units in under 30 minutes. It was crazy. Their numbers were off the charts, and we saw growth month over month, and everybody, like, there was announcements on how great they were doing. Meanwhile, everybody was like, quality assurance, what's happening, guys? You guys are terrible at your jobs, because their numbers were just at the bottom they could possibly be. And it's because the repair group would basically just like patch any superficial things up, make it pass their very narrow test, and then kick it off to quality assurance. And so we had this instance where like nobody looked at the big picture. Each department had their own siloed things, and they just didn't work with each other. And so one number went up, one number went down, and there wasn't some unifying factor to join those.
Right. And I think that's really important, right? From really looking at the big picture when it comes to the destination, because there's a lot of implications. It's not just about the hotels. You've got sometimes short-term rentals, and obviously the hotels care about the hotels. Short-term rentals care only about the short-term rental, and they're different, right? But also room demand can also indicate growth in supply, right? And how that changes over time. But then the type of hotel you build will impact who you attract into the destination, right? Yeah. So all of those things have to be somehow holistically looked at, and the DMO has the great opportunity to do that. And it doesn't always mean that we'll have a great impact, in decision making as a whole for the city or the destination, but it is the DMO has the opportunity to really look at it holistically. Yeah. So Oren, from your perspective, from KPIs, we're talking about time, right? So when should you be looking at KPIs from a destination marketer? When should you start? Does that change over time? Or do you need to reassess, right? So want to take us through that?
I think that comes down to the destination primarily, but at the very least, you should always be having KPIs in your media campaigns. So let's say a destination, for example, cares about monthly occupancy, monthly room demand, ADR, RevPAR. Typically, we'll look at that on a monthly basis because that's when the information comes through. It's on a monthly basis. You can go down to the day, but for analyzing overall trends, looking at a monthly basis may be more appropriate. If you have a destination, though, that let's say it's a smaller drive market and they're more focused on individuals coming to local attractions every single day, KPIs may need to be monitored every week, especially during your peak season. Let's say you have a small attraction and their big season is the summer and it's daily visitors. That is their KPI that they care about, and we've assessed their system and that works for them. We'd want to be looking at that and monitoring that every week to make sure that their campaign is executing the way it should, to make sure our creative is reaching the right audience, to make sure that we're bolstering those numbers during the peak months. Now, when we get to the off season, maybe we change. Maybe it's every 2 weeks, maybe it's every month. But again, it really does come down to the client type, what they're trying to measure, and again, the seasonality factors, the secondary KPIs we care about. There's a lot that goes into that formula.
Yeah. So Dana, what are your thoughts if a destination marketer, goes to a session or some summit and learns of something new? should they panic immediately and say, "Oh, yeah, I got to change my KPIs now"? Or, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, no, never panic. Never panic. Acting with panic is not acting with thought. That's acting with emotion. If you were going to change your KPIs, it all goes back to what your goal is. If there's this new metric that comes out because there's this new company that's tracking this new thing, like you need to thoroughly understand your KPIs and really just understand that KPIs, what it tells you and what it doesn't tell you. Because at the end of the day, your KPI needs to be as closely defined to your goal as possible. If there's a new metric that comes out that actually is close to your goal, then yes, then maybe it would be okay to switch, but it would have to be a thorough conversation. And like, if you are also, I personally like the idea of setting a set amount of KPIs as opposed to, like a new metric comes out, let's add another. Now we have 5. Now we have 6. Now we have 7.
Right.
Now like that gets bloated, and you're not actually focused on what your goal is. And so kind of setting a set number. And if you are going to say, oh, let's switch to using this new metric, well then say, well, which metric do I want to demote? Which metric am I not going to focus on? Because I almost like on the topic of having a smaller number of KPIs, I also think of it in the same realm as I've noticed this for my personal self. When I have shorter to-do list, I am more likely to complete all of those items. Like, let's say I have a to-do list of 4 items. I'm more likely to complete those 4 items than opposed to if I have a longer to-do list. And okay, obviously, if I have more things to do, I'm not going to complete all of them. But I am more likely to complete 4 items on a 4-item to-do list than 4 items on a 8-item to-do list, because it's overwhelming, and it's focusing. Yeah, focusing on the most important thing makes you more likely to actually achieve that thing than like trying to achieve everything all at once.
Right. So you've mentioned goal multiple times. So are you basically indicating as a DMO, or you should have a goal or an objective you're trying to reach, right? And then the KPIs become these kind of cluster gauges where you're monitoring how you're basically moving towards that goal. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is exactly how you should be thinking about KPIs.
Yeah.
Because if one of those KPIs is off pace, then you can have that conversation, as opposed to having so many different dials and getting overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I'd like to throw one little thing on that too. And that's when we come across this idea of like, we should change our KPI. Something to consider, and kind of going with the cluster gauge analogy. Now imagine you're driving and all of a sudden your speedometer switches from miles per hour to kilometers an hour. It's going to throw you for a loop. There's going to be a time of adapting. You're going to be mentally doing this translation between the two for a while until you get adapted. And that's like a simple kind of best case scenario, because you can kind of get a rough sense of like, there's a very clear like correlation between those two things. There's a literal equation to translate between them. When you change a KPI though, it might be measured fundamentally different than the thing you're demoting or the thing you're changing. And you might end up with something where you can't look over a long period of time to see how you've been trending, like in general. And so I've seen this a lot throughout my career, is having just this constantly rotating pool of KPI, kind of chasing the next best thing or the more accurate thing. And there is a certain amount of like benefit to just sticking with something long term, so that you can get a real sense of progress over time.
Right.
You can always look good if you just change your KPI every month. You can always be like, oh, look at the numbers high. Yeah. It's like, high compared to what? Like 2 years ago? Like, who's to say?
And I want to quickly touch on just what Dana said when she said it anchors our North Star. I'm sure the audience already understands this. We've said KPIs many times, but the KPI is to help you cut through the BS of all the noise of your data. The KPI should be 1, making sense to you, and 2, helping you achieve your goals. If you look at your KPIs and they're not doing that for you, then they don't make sense. It's time to reassess, but they're not supposed to add more confusion. They're not supposed to, in the simplest terms, not make sense to what your destination is doing. They're supposed to inform your campaigns, your marketing, your media.
And one of the things too that is, very interesting from a KPI versus objectives or business goals is many times as a DMO or a destination, your business objective is a long-term objective. You're talking 3-year goal, 2-year goal, right? So you want to make sure you have the right framework of KPIs that will help you achieve that over the course of time, knowing that some of those gauges might change a year from now as you've reached certain parameters in your goal. But as you continue to go through that process, it's extremely important that you see that big picture, that real world, right? What are we really trying to get to in an effort for us to ultimately achieve it, right? Because that's the reason why we do what we do, is we're monitoring all these gauges and all these things to make sure that ultimately we achieve that objective. So,
and kind of building on the analogy more, because we're still talking in terms of this like cluster gauge that's right in front of us. I mean, I think it's important to remember it's like the car's going somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the important thing. Like we can focus on, here's our compass, here's our tachometer, here's our speedometer and stuff like that. But if we start to get too focused on that piece of it and don't just look up and see, oh shoot, I was driving from Virginia to California and somehow I ended up down in the Keys in Florida. It's
right.
like not where I intended to go. And all that data isn't going to do any good if you aren't just driving the car at the end of the day.
Right. Right. So what are some of your final thoughts? If you could share, what is it that you recommend to the destinations that they do as they embark on this process of developing objectives, business objectives, KPIs? What are your kind of final thoughts on that, Jeff?
Yeah, it's really, really take the time to understand, like, what are your goals? What are you measuring? Like, understand the ecosystem. Like, plan just as much as you plan to follow up on these KPIs. Really make sure that you're measuring the right thing and tracking the right thing so that you're heading the right direction and you are going to make it to California and not the Keys.
Yeah. What about you, Oren?
When it comes to KPIs, I always think that less is more in terms of KPIs. For a destination, my final thoughts would be make sure everyone on your marketing team understands what you are driving towards.
Yeah.
If even one person doesn't understand it, you probably don't have your KPIs defined clearly enough. And if multiple people aren't sure why we're monitoring it, it probably doesn't make sense for your destination. So make sure your KPIs make sense and are aiding you.
Yeah. Awesome. Dana, what about you?
Keep it simple.
Mhm.
Try to keep it as simple as possible, because sometimes when you get into the nitty-gritty, it's not, and that can be overwhelming. But trying to keep it as simple as possible, as opposed to overloading it with these things that maybe won't make sense, aren't actually
Right.
indicative of your larger goals. So keep it simple and short, similar to what Oren and Jeb had said.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. I think I'll touch on that as well. Right. I love the word SMIT, single most important thing. And often thinking about that, as time goes on, really just pause and reassess. Is this still the most important thing? Is this really trying to achieve that objective? And the final thought from my perspective is it's okay to regularly analyze your KPIs, right? And assess, is this the right thing I should measure? Is this the right thing? And know that you can change if necessary, right? But just constantly assessing, is this the right thing, is a good thing. It doesn't mean you'll need to change it, or it doesn't mean that you want to get more of them, but really just keeping it simple, reassessing over time, and having those discussions with the team members. As you said, Oren, that's extremely critical. If your team members don't know, or your board doesn't know, right, or they're not aligned, I think that's extremely important. So, well, guys, this is all the time we have for today. We really appreciate your thoughts here, and thank you guys for coming here with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank
having
you
us.
so much.
If you enjoyed this episode and would like to stay updated on future episodes, be sure to subscribe to the Predictive Pulse podcast. Whether you're a data enthusiast, marketer, or business leader, our aim is to provide you with the latest media and analytics trends to help you tap into tomorrow's insights today. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics, feel free to reach out. We value your feedback and are always eager to hear from our listeners. Thank you again for joining us on this data-driven journey. And until next time, stay ahead of the curve with the Predictive Pulse podcast.